Makes you feel alright. You know how hard it can be, the way things are going. They're gonna crucify me. Help! I need somebody. Help! Not just anybody. Help! You know I need someone. Help! Sweeping, still my guitar gently weeps.
This is Richard Solomon. Welcome to Taking Care of Business. Last week, we had the first part of our interview with Beatles historian and archivist from the BBC, Kevin Howlett. This is the continuation of that interview. He is an incredible guest.
The audience research reports throughout the book, for instance, Magical Mystery Tour in 1967, there's a replica of that report. And boy, did that go down in a kind of mostly negative way to the British public.
I see, by the way, I happen to have that also in front of me because it's just a wonderful piece of authorship. And it says here that, they gave letter grades, A+, A, B, C, and C-, and it was amazing to see a 51% of C-.
Yeah,
and,
yeah. Well, the comments that are quoted, the biggest waste of public money since the ground nut scheme. I wonder what the ground nut scheme was. Positively the worst program I can remember seeing on any TV channel.
Yeah, and that's a load of rubbish. You have made better home movies. We have made better home movies ourselves.
Yeah. I do remember the controversy caused by Magical Mystery Tour when that was shown on a holiday that we call Boxing Day, the day after Christmas Day in the UK. And so I was 10, and I vividly remember the discussion about it. I remember a family gathering and my father defending the film against one of my uncles, and people were just baffled by it. And they were expecting something so different, the normal kind of program transmitted at that time on Boxing Day evening would be a light entertainment show, very undemanding. And, something like Benny Hill, who I believe had some success in America.
He did. Yes, he was on public television locally here in New York on what is called Channel 13, WNET. Yes.
Right. Well, Magical Mystery Tour was a long way from Benny Hill. But, at the end of the report, there is a schoolboy who makes a lovely comment. He says, let me find the bit. A schoolboy made a lovely comment. He says, "It was one of the best Christmas programs we've had for a long time. The idea was so clever as well as original. It was very funny in parts. Marvelous program in black and white. In color, it would be indescribable." Because that's the other thing. Most people had black and white TV sets in this country. And it was shown for the first time on BBC One, which only broadcast in black and white. It was repeated on BBC Two in color a while later. But hardly anybody had BBC Two, and hardly anybody had a color TV set. So all those color sequences, if you're familiar with Magical Mystery Tour, didn't work so well in black and white. But the music was wonderful, of course.
How much of the movies like Help and Hard Day's Night and Magical Mystery Tour were really the precursors for what ultimately became music videos, and then after that, music television. Was that really the beginning?
I think so. I think you can definitely make the connection to MTV from Hard Day's Night and Help. And Dick Lester was so brilliant as a director, and there are so many innovative ideas in the sequences that go with the songs in those two films that really influenced the development of the pop video. And the Beatles actually made promo films that would be distributed around the world fairly early on in their career. You know, they realized they couldn't appear on every TV show that wanted them, and so they decided to make their own promotional films. They weren't called videos in those days, but they would make promotional films for things like Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out, and, you know, onwards from there, Paperback Writer and Rain. And so, you know, they really started that whole thing and did it extremely well. But, you know, I love that bit in Help, you know, when they're skiing down the slope and musical notes appear on telegraph wires above the ski slope. Oh, it's just really inventive stuff. And actually one of the most seductive scenes from the point of view of I'd really love to be involved in the music business and the record business is the scene in Help when they're performing You're Gonna Lose That Girl. You know, I saw that at 8, and just seeing the Beatles in a studio and singing into those wonderful microphones hanging from the ceiling. And, you know, there's lots of smoke in the scene, so the light is filtering through the cigarette smoke. And it's all tinted in blue, and it's just, it's a wonderful, wonderful sequence for You're Gonna Lose That Girl. And you think, it must be so brilliant to be in a studio. I remember actually at the time, so knocked out by that we got some plastic Skittles and hung them from somebody's garage roof and pretended we were singing into the microphones like they were in Help.
Oh, wow.
With my plastic Beatles guitar.
Physically at the BBC, is there, like, I know there's the archives, and I'd like you to describe that a little bit, but is there sort of like the studios that they played in? Because if you go to Memphis, you go to Sun Records, and you could actually stand at the spot and touch the microphone that Elvis, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis, the famous $1 Million Quartet.
I've been to Sun Studios myself a while back now, 25 years ago maybe, and you can be in the room and realize, you know, the dimensions of that. For example, there's a plaque in the BBC Maida Vale studios that draws people's attention to the fact that the Beatles did 2 sessions at Maida Vale for Pop Go the Beatles, but the studio itself has been changed since they did that and modernized and just replanned. There's a sub-basement studio in Broadcasting House in the centre of London, S2, where the Beatles recorded. It is possible to walk into that studio and see how huge it is. It's a bit like Studio 3 in Abbey Road, a really big orchestral studio. But sadly, the Paris Cinema Theatre studio, where they recorded many programs, including lots of Pop Go the Beatles programs, the BBC sold that. They acquired it, I think, during the war. It was an underground cinema, and they thought, with all the bombing going on, it would be good to have an underground studio so that we can continue to broadcast without being disturbed. And so this cinema was converted to, this movie theatre was converted to a radio studio. And I went in there a few times in my early BBC career, but that was sold about 20 years ago, I think, maybe less.
What is actually in the physical BBC archives, and what have you processed, and what remains to be unearthed?
Well, the written archives, which I mentioned, which is remarkable because they kept on file all sorts of memos and contracts and audience research reports that we've just been discussing. That's not in London. It's about 40 miles out of London, and it's in a very unassuming looking building. Just it's what we call a bungalow. It's just one floor, and you think, how could they possibly contain all this paperwork in this little building? I'm sure it goes deep into the ground because you go in there and you'd say, I'd like to see these files, and somebody disappears. And a few minutes later, they come in with a trolley full of these files, and you think, I wonder where they went. It's quite mysterious, but it is thrilling to look through all those files, these dusty files. And, for example, at the beginning of last year, when I was researching the TV side of the Beatles' BBC career, which I hadn't really done before, I'd really concentrated on their radio work, and so it was fascinating to learn about their TV appearances, and there were some great surprises and revelations when I was going through the files for that.
Such as?
Well, there's in the file of replica documents, there's a John Lennon letter that he typed and wrote his signature and a little note on the bottom. So I was going through a file and found that. It was for a program that he appeared on called Release, which was in June 1968. He recorded the interview. And it was to discuss the National Theatre's production based on two of his books, In His Own Right and Spaniard in the Works. And Victor Spinetti, an actor who had appeared in Help, A Hard Day's Night and Magical Mystery Tour, was helping John to do that. And both of them were interviewed at Abbey Road for this TV program. And you can read the full transcript of the interview in my book. And more of the written transcript survives than the actual footage from the interview. There's only sections of the interview surviving on film, but in the file I found the full transcript of what John said in the interview. But in the interview he got quite political. I think it was just before John and Yoko really started to do all their protests for peace, and he turns to the camera and looks directly into the lens. It's quite a moment actually when you see it on film. And he says, "I think our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. Don't you agree?" Looking straight at the TV audience. And I think he'd heard that bit had been cut out and various other things he'd said along that theme, which was not the case. But he wrote to the producer and said, "Why have you cut the only bit of real communication out of my release interview? Love," and then he signed John Lennon, and then wrote underneath, "Or so I've heard." And the producer wrote back immediately and said, no, all the pieces direct to the camera remain in the interview. No, don't worry. But, finding that letter from John with his signature on is quite a thrill. And I thought I'd like to share that thrill by having that particular document reproduced for the book in this file of documents.
Which I'm holding in my hand. It was kind of interesting is that he used love, not best regards, not fondly, not very truly yours, but love. That's really both profound and interesting. Both,
yeah, it is
from a perspective and from looking back.
This is Richard Solomon. You are listening to a very special interview with Kevin Howlett of the BBC, the archivist and historian for the Beatles, and celebrated author and radio producer. Keep listening. This is quite an interview. Richard Solomon. You are listening to a very special interview with Kevin Howlett of the BBC, the archivist and historian for the Beatles, and celebrated author and radio producer.
Because they did this groundbreaking TV program called Our World, which was broadcast to 5 continents by satellite, one of the first to do so, and they performed All You Need Is Love for that, and they were in Abbey Road supposedly recording the single, and the world was going to eavesdrop on them recording the single. There were files and files and files about that program. It's such an important program. And in one of the files, which deals with the Beatles' appearance for the program, there was a fantastic telegram that I discovered, which the producer of the outside broadcast from Abbey Road had met the group and discussed what they were going to do. And he was so excited by the meeting that he sent a telegram to the executive producer of the program and reported back on what he'd discussed with the Beatles. And that telegram was really fascinating. Instead of saying the Beatles, in a jokey way, I think he says, "Our World Beat Group in 2 hours meeting, aware challenge. Enthusiastic actuality setting," meaning Abbey Road and recording the single. Responsive to world stage, agree 5 minutes participation, writing new number with basic words such as hello, love, you, me, us, them, we, together. Possible words sung in several languages. Well, of course, That's All You Need Is Love, and it confirms that they wrote that song especially for the broadcast. And the meeting was on the 17th of May, and they performed on the 25th of June, so it was all turned around pretty quickly there. And that was a thrill. And also in the Telegraph it says, intend indicates swinging London, happening hoped for, very much a 60s word, a happening. And of course you see the footage of them performing All You Need Is Love at Abbey Road, and it is a happening, and all the beautiful people in their wonderful clothes are there. Jagger and Keith Richards and Brian Jones and Marianne Faithfull, and it's wonderful. And I remember staying up to watch that as a 10-year-old, and I recall that they were very late on in the program. It ran from 8 to 10 in the evening in the UK, and you had to sit through some quite boring films from other countries who were participating and think, when will the Beatles be on? And then suddenly, and now over to Abbey Road and the Beatles. It was so exciting.
When you grew up and you listened to all of this as it was happening, did you have a sense that you were just part of something bigger than it really was?
Well, I was always convinced that there would never be a time in my life when I wouldn't want to listen to this music, because that was still a common perception from older people about this new music, that you'll grow out of it. It's a teenage thing, a childish thing. This music, you won't want to listen to that when you're a grown-up. And I remember clearly listening to Sgt. Pepper when I was 10 years old, and I'm thinking that there'll never be a time in my life when I won't love this album. I'm convinced of that. And I remember also a few years later, just after the Beatles had split up, in fact, and I remember talking to my friends on the school bus and saying, the Beatles, it's like the classical music of now, 200 years' time.
Yeah.
People are listening to this music just like people listen to Tchaikovsky now or Mozart, I was saying these rather precocious things at the time, but I'm still convinced of that. I still think the music is so great that why would it go away? It's just the same as people will still want to watch Casablanca or Citizen Kane, in 50 years' time, because they're great, great movies and they still have the power to move people. Well, this music clearly has the power to connect to every generation. I've watched it with my own children. They absolutely connect to that music at a very young age, as I did at a very young age. And
then you share that with your children.
Yeah, I deliberately wouldn't force feed them the Beatles. But I remember with my eldest, we were listening to the radio, and All You Need Is Love was on the radio. And he said, I like this, Dad. Who's this? I said, that's the Beatles. I tell you what, it was in the age of cassette tapes. I think I'll do a cassette with some Beatles songs on. So I chose things like Piggies and Blackbird and Yellow Submarine and things that I thought that a very young child would connect to. And the Yellow Submarine movie has been watched by all three of my children at a very early age. That, again, is so attractive to a young child because of the brilliant colors and the humor of it, and they love the music, and it can't fail to connect to young people, in my opinion, if they get the opportunity to see and hear the Beatles.
So as an adult, an historian and an archaeologist and an archivist, what do you now derive out of both the music and the history that you may not have appreciated as a youth?
Well, it's funny because obviously I've heard this music so many times over the years, but never grown tired of it. I think that's interesting. And in fact, as time goes on, and you listen to the music that has been around over those years, in a way it convinces you even more how great it is. Because I think in the 60s, which was a particularly wonderful creative time with so many brilliant performers in addition to the Beatles, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, Bob Dylan, just so many brilliant songwriters and artists. You kind of had the feeling that it would always be this great, and that people of that stature would always come along. But I think there was something about the era, and maybe the education that these artists had in their youth, and the circumstances of the time, that created these brilliant artists. And, whereas, I've continued to enjoy music, of course, and I am a radio producer, so I am involved in finding and playing on the radio new music, and I'm always wanting to discover some great new music. But as time goes by, you realize that that era was a particularly golden era. And, it's just, history has shown that there are, the stars align and planets align for some reason and create a golden era. And the Beatles were part of a golden era. And I think partly also they inspired a golden era because, they set the bar so high. It's quite true that the Beach Boys were inspired by what the Beatles were doing. Brian Wilson, he heard Rubber Soul and thought, my goodness, I see what we have to compete with now. And Simon and Garfunkel, who I just love their records and their solo records too. It was quite clear that they were inspired totally by what the Beatles were doing. The attitude the Beatles had to recording music. Art Garfunkel has said, I've been fortunate to make radio programs about these great people. And Art Garfunkel said, when you heard Sgt. Pepper, you knew that that was the standard. You were making records that they weren't throwaway, they weren't ephemeral, they would be around, and that's the way we approached making records in those days, And so we would absolutely invest all our creative energy into making as great a record as possible. It wasn't just commerce, this was art,
And wisdom, because when I listen to the words and I read the lyrics, I see such profound wisdom in people who are so relatively young.
Yeah, I think that's staggering too, when you consider how young they were when they were making this music and writing these songs. On the Live at the BBC Volume 2 album, there are 4 pop profile interviews included as bonus tracks. They're 7-minute interviews with each of the Beatles, and they're talking about the effects of fame in their personal lives, and they're, again, quite radical for pop musicians to be interviewed at that length at that time. And then 2 of them are recorded at the end of November 65 and 2 in May 66. And they seem to be so reflective and so much older than the Beatles that you hear in the 63, 64 short interviews where they're having a laugh with the BBC presenters. Yet this is only a couple of years later, and then you realize how young they are. It's just extraordinary. None of them are older than 25 at the time, and that's just mind-boggling to think about that. What they achieved at such a young age.
I think about what I was like when I was 25, and I look at what they achieved, and you're like, holy cow. It's just...
Well, my own children too, the eldest is 25, and, you think, my goodness, I suppose you're always a parent and you always regard your children as children, but, the Beatles had been through so much. But I think the other remarkable thing is in the songwriting, for John and Paul to collaborate on In My Life, and it's important to realize that wasn't just old John. Paul did have an input into the song In My Life. But that's such a mature song when you listen to it. Just a brilliant song, and tinged with such regret and sadness and melancholy. And it's so touching when you think, again, how young he was when he wrote that. And Eleanor Rigby, I don't think it's possible to make a better record than Eleanor Rigby. I just don't, and you have to remember how radical it was when it arrived, for a pop single to just be, a double string quartet with Paul's voice on top and some harmony on the chorus. Just, again, what no one would expect, This was a guitar and bass and drums group, and now you've got a double string quartet doing Eleanor Rigby, and the lyrics are just so brilliant. But the empathy, all the lonely people. I mean, I think that's the other extraordinary thing is they were so inclusive. There wasn't this thing that we're young and hip and cool and you older people are excluded. It was never, ever, ever like that with the Beatles. You're all invited. You can all take part. It's just the attitude that you bring to the music, There's no reason that you will be excluded just because you're a certain age. It's all about attitude. If you watch the promotional film they made for Hey Jude, when the audience come on and sing the na-na-na-nas at the end, you've got every kind of age you can imagine, and every sort of ethnic group seems to be represented. It's like everyone can join in and be part of this, And I love that. I really don't like music which is so cool that it thinks, you just have to have a certain lifestyle to appreciate this.
How much of that, pardon me, how much of that do you think was a byproduct of both World War II and the fact that Paul and John lost a parent early in their lives?
Yeah, well, those two factors are very important, I think. The fact that they were growing up in Liverpool post-World War II, which was really still very bombed out, even by the 60s. There were lots and lots of shells of buildings around, and it had not really been regenerated, so there were lots of bomb sites. It was pretty grim. So there's that idea of, we've got to aspire to something better than this and escape, and there was that intellectual curiosity as well that was fostered by the grammar school that George and Paul went to, the Liverpool Institute, and John went to Quarry Bank. They were grammar school boys, and at that point the education system was really good and encouraged them to be independent thinkers and have great curiosity about all sorts of things. So that's another aspect of the Beatles. They were so into art and film and poetry and all sorts of things that it's not just the music. So that's important. And the fact that John and Paul both lost their mothers in their teens, I think that's incredibly important because there was obviously a void and an emotional void that they had to fill, and music was part of that. And I think it may have given them some sort of extra drive as well to really aspire to just reach for the stars, really. I think, I'm not a psychologist, but I think there are other instances of other musicians or artists who have a bereavement in their teenage years that has a profound effect on them and does influence the way they create and their drive to make it as well.
This is Richard Solomon. You are listening to a very special interview with Kevin Howlett of the BBC, the archivist and historian for the Beatles, and celebrated author and radio producer. Keep listening. This is quite an interview. Richard Solomon. You are listening to a very special interview with Kevin Howlett of the BBC, the archivist and historian for the Beatles, and celebrated author and radio producer.
This sounds like a cliche, but it's actually true that people would gather around the piano in a pub and sing songs, and they'd all know them. They'd be the old songs, but the kids knew them too. And there was a great community about that. This is pre-TV age, remember. In the transcript of the John Lennon interview from 1968, when he's talking about the National Theatre production, they talk about TV, and he says, I didn't really get a TV in our house until I was old, and I was going out, so I didn't bother to watch it. So, they grew up, the radio was the thing, and the radio is much more imaginative than TV. And the Goon show, which I mentioned earlier, the comedy show, that was so so imaginative, and just bizarre things would come into this comedy, and your mind would be imagining all these incredible, vivid pictures. And so growing up with the radio and making music together, rather than just sitting down and watching the television or spending time on social media, as people do these days, it kind of encourages more creativity. That's not to condemn all sort of digital and computer and social media activities, because some of that is incredibly creative. I mean, the things that people do on YouTube and parodies of other videos and things, it's remarkable when you see those things. But it was a different kind of creativity when they were growing up as teenagers in the 50s, and definitely music making and the opportunities that rock and roll gave you to make music and play music and be together in groups. I mean, Ringo, in an interview in the book, does indicate that, music saved him really from a life of delinquency. He said he was in a teenage gang for a little bit. But then, his neighbor was forming a skiffle group, as they were called, in just pre-rock and roll. And he started playing in that. And, instead of being up to no good, he was playing music. And I think that was so true of many, many people in that era. Music became the thing.
A healthy gang,
It was a healthy gang, and
healthy gang, yeah.
Very, very important, that sense of community and playing music together. It's such a great thing to do.
So, how do you see your relationship with the Beatles now? Because you've written so much and you've done liner notes. What is your relationship now?
Well, I'm very fortunate to be involved in Beatles projects, and it's a great privilege to be involved. I think it, as well as it being a privilege, it does bring a great responsibility. I think it's so important to, again, maintain that standard, so that all the album projects and the sleeve notes and the artwork that I'm involved in, it has to be of the highest quality. And the people who are involved in that, along with me, we really go to the nth degree to make sure everything is as right as it can be and looks as good as it can be. I was so thrilled to be involved in a box set that came out at the end of 2012, which was a box set of the Beatles vinyl LPs, and it has a beautiful hardback book in it. And I wrote the text for that book. It's kind of like the director's cut on the notes I'd written for the CDs, and the chapters are much lengthier on each album, and there are other chapters I wrote. And that book is just one of the most beautiful books I've ever seen, from the point of view of the way it's been illustrated and getting all the right pictures, and the way they've been reproduced. So I think that's the thing, maintaining the standard. And the Beatles set the standard for everybody in just aspiring to do more than was necessary. I think that's really important. Again, I talked to Tom Petty about the Beatles, and he said, at the height of their power, they could have chosen. At the height of their power, they could have chosen to do anything, but they chose to do good. You can apply that in looking at the Beatles' career in so many areas. They chose to do good in the fact that they spread a very positive, powerful message of love. They chose to really go to the extremes to make the music as bold and exciting as possible, and the artwork was always striking and different. Every aspect of the Beatles' career is just, we're aspiring to be better than before. It's just really the pursuit of excellence. And, in today's culture, it might be regarded as commercial disaster to do some of the things they did. Why do you want to release a record, Strawberry Fields Forever? I mean, this will never be a hit. Why don't you just do like the last one, Well, no, that was just never a consideration. It didn't seem to have any commercial sellout in mind. It's just, this is what we want to do. This is, we're creative artists, Yeah, well, if the public don't like it, well, that's sad, but this is what we want to do. And of course, they weren't always the best-selling group at the time. You have to remember that.
See, that's hard to really fathom in some
Yeah,
ways.
I mean, the Monkees sold more records in 1967 than the Beatles did. But because they had that aspiration to be so great, in the long term, they've sold more records than anybody else because people keep buying them. They know this is the best pop music there ever was. So, it paid off. They never made a commercial compromise, as far as I can see. Never. In Britain, they hardly released singles off albums. Well, how can you release an album in the UK with Yesterday on it and not release that as a single? Came out in America as a single, but not in Britain. You had to buy the LP to have Yesterday, or an EP had it on. And same with the White Album. It's just full of hit songs, but we're not going to release any of them as singles in Britain or America. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, no, it's not a single. Obla-Dee Obla-Da, no, we're not releasing that as a single. And of course, in this country, somebody else did release it as a single. It went to number one. So, when an album came out by the Beatles, other groups would kind of immediately get it and think, "Oh, right, which one should we cover? Because we're sure to have a number one."
What can we? Well, everything that you say makes me think of like 10 additional questions. But how does it? Well, what comes to mind first is how does that affect you on the radio? In terms of what you hear, in terms of newer music, in terms of what you plan in your production, and potentially future projects, either in written or music form?
Well, if you're into the Beatles and a real fan of the Beatles, then you'll also be a fan of so much other music, because I think the thing about the Beatles is they were so curious about so many different forms of music that you can't help but be interested too. So, I have a huge record collection and a very, very eclectic taste that runs across all the musical forms you can think of. So I remember I was interviewed by BBC News when Free as a Bird came out, and they said, how do you want to be described? Because they wanted me to comment upon Free as a Bird. And I said, well, you could call me a music radio producer and Beatles historian, if you like. And then in the queue, they said something like, Kevin Howlett lives, breathes, and eats the Beatles. Well, that was not what I wanted, because, obviously it is a specialism of mine, and I'm delighted to be someone so involved in projects to do with the Beatles. But I love all kinds of music, and I've made radio documentaries about Paul Simon, Frank Zappa, Leonard Cohen, Jerry Wexler, David Bowie, so many different artists, and they're all fascinating, and I love all kinds of music. But that all spins off my early love of the Beatles, I think, as a child. That they opened the door to all these different avenues, and artistic avenues outside music, film and literature. You respond to the fact that, John, these books are poetry, and then that would spin you off into other areas, and you'd watch the films, and Magical Mystery Tour would just completely open your eyes to other kinds of filmmaking. And so it's that intellectual curiosity of the Beatles will rub off on you if you're a fan of the Beatles, and they were so curious about everything that hopefully you will be too. And so if you love the Beatles, they'll take you into all sorts of interesting areas, and that's wonderful.
So do you have a 78 collection and a 8-track tape collection as well?
Certainly not 8-track tapes, no.
I do.
I did inherit my brother's 78s. He gave them to me when he left home to get married, and he gave me half his 45s. He kept the Everly Brothers and things like that, but he gave me the Ricky Nelson and Elvis ones and all sorts of great records, and that was so influential. And I learnt my rock and roll by listening to the Everly Brothers on 78 and Elvis on 78. So I have those. Nothing to play them on at the moment, though. But yeah, I mean, I love vinyl records. That's the other thing, of course, which is a whole other subject to get into. But there's just something so wonderful about the experience of playing a record and the sleeve and the way that you look after it. And,
the artwork.
Yeah, the artwork is so great, and CD could never be as beautiful as vinyl records.
Or a download.
And downloads are just so anonymous, You see, my kids don't mind, as long as they have the music on their computer, that's great. But when I was young, if you loved a record, you had to express your love for the record by buying it and owning it and staring at it and reading every single thing on the label and poring over the artwork of the sleeve, and that was all part of your life, really. This record means so much to me, and there it is. It's a physical manifestation of the music that you love, and that's continued with me. I mean, I really feel a great bond with the physical carrier of the music, whereas, as I say, my children don't have that bond at all. As long as they can hear the music, they don't care what it looks like, but I do.
So what future projects can we look forward to? What do you have? Do you have anything in the pipeline right now?
You mean Beatles orientated?
Or anything? Just
right.
Because what you do is fascinating. I am truly
fascinated.
fascinated.
I'm currently producing a program for Radio 2 in this country, which you can probably hear on the BBC website. It goes out on a Saturday evening at 8 o'clock, and it's called West Coast Johnny Walker. Johnny Walker is a veteran DJ in this country. Has been broadcasting in this country for nearly 50 years, actually.
Wow. Started
very young on what was called pirate radio at the time. And Johnny is presenting this program I'm producing, and it's a program which captures the spirit of the freeform FM radio stations of the late 60s and early 70s in America. So I'm having a wonderful time putting the music together for that, which includes all those great records by Crosby, Stills and Nash, Joni Mitchell, Jackson Browne, James Taylor, and unusual things by groups like Pearls Before Swine and Moby Grape and the Electric Prunes. And,
I remember the Electric Prunes.
Yeah, well, it's just a wonderful, and we do a lot of segues on themes, and so that's my current project, which is wonderful, and after that I'm doing a program for the speech network in this country called Radio 4, which is connected to the poet John Betjeman. So there you go. That's a bit of variety.
Wow. Well, I like this. You've been incredibly generous with your time, and I probably could have talked to you for 4 or 5 days on this. Right. And I would always welcome the opportunity to have you talk about any of your other topics or books or digital recordings or archival work. Is there a website or anything that's particular for your work? Or your shows, or any of your production that people can be pointed to?
I encourage people to look at the BBC website. You can hear that West Coast Johnny Walker, I believe, in America, on that BBC Radio 2 page. It's broadcast on there, and it's available for 7 days to stream. So that would be a good starting point. But anyway, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you so
very much.
I really appreciate the opportunity. It's a wonderful book, and I really look forward to listening to you. I'm going to definitely be checking out the BBC website, and I look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
This is Richard Solomon from Taking Care of Business.